Agreed. Agreed and so ordered. Orders of the day.
Government orders, business of supply.
Kinder Morgan Transport Mountain Extension Project.
Mr. Strahl, seconded by Mr. Ritz, moves that the House agree that the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project, A, has social license to proceed, B, is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, C, is safe and environmentally sound, as recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board, D, is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation, and E, should be constructed with the continued support of the federal government as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of the project. The Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and indeed it is a pleasure to rise in the House to move this motion on behalf of the official opposition, and we think it's a critical time for this House to pronounce on the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan expansion project, a project that was personally approved by the Prime Minister in November of last year. And before I begin, I would like to inform the House that I will be sharing my time with the member for Lakeland, a passionate defender of the oil and gas sector in her riding and right across the country, standing up for energy workers in this country. The motion is very clear. It simply outlines that this House should reiterate its support for the Prime Minister's position on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, that this project has social license, as the Prime Minister indicated in his statement of November 30th, that it's safe, that it's reliable, that it should proceed, and that the appropriate steps have been taken to ensure that it will be constructed in an environmentally safe way. And that's really what this is about. We often talk about pipelines in isolation, but the fact is that pipelines are the safest way to transport energy products in this country. Pipelines have a proven record of reliability. It's safer than rail. And just this morning, I read an article about record rail shipments to the United States, over 150,000 barrels a day going by rail to the United States. That's what happens when we don't have the proper amount of pipeline capacity. More oil goes by rail. And while that also is a safe way to transport energy products, it's not as safe as pipelines. That's why we support this pipeline, which has been approved by the National Energy Board as safe. It's been proven that it can be done in an environmentally sound way with 157 conditions imposed on the proponent, and we support that. And we think it's important that we do. It's a $6.8 billion capital investment by the company. It will create 15,000 new jobs during construction, and secondary jobs in the oil sands will be in the thousands as well, because we know that there is a pipeline capacity issue right now. If we don't address that, there will be layoffs, further putting the fragile recovery in our oil and gas sector at risk. In my own riding, the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan pipeline comes through my riding. It's been there since the early 1950s. This is a pipeline that has delivered oil from Alberta to Burnaby for over 60 years. And there has never been a major incident in my riding, on the section of pipe that goes through my riding. As far as I know, there's been 2 incidents, one at a tank farm in Sumas, where the redundancies at the Sumas tank plant kicked in, and every drop of oil was recovered that spilled over when a valve froze during the winter. Every drop of oil was recovered, and the system worked perfectly. The other time was in Burnaby, when a contractor punctured the pipeline with a backhoe. So hardly the fault of the pipeline that it was punctured by someone who made a human error. That was not a result of the pipeline, it was a result of human error. In my own riding, I have sought the views of my constituents. I put out a survey to every single household in my riding, asking them if they thought that the Prime Minister should approve the Trans Mountain Expansion project, and it elicited a lot of responses. I had thousands of people reply, and about 55% of people who took the time to reply said yes, they supported the expansion. So there's significant concern even in my own community. People are concerned about whether a pipeline can operate safely over our precious water aquifer. There's a group in my riding called Water Wealth that's one of their primary purpose is to make sure that the water aquifer, the waters in our area are protected. I wrote to the Minister of Natural Resources on their behalf. It took him 7 months to reply, but he said, that he believed the National Energy Board process had adequately addressed their concerns on the aquifer and that routing decisions would be made by the National Energy Board. But there are concerns, and but that's why we need to hear from the Prime Minister in British Columbia. In Alberta, I think that we've seen there is consent across the political spectrum that pipelines are beneficial for the economy and that they can be built safely. In BC, there's a little more skepticism. And that's why we need the Prime Minister of Canada to come to British Columbia and finally start to sell this project in my home province. I've been in rooms of oil executives with the Prime Minister in Houston, Texas. There he's quite proud to talk about approving the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline, to great applause from oil executives from all over the world. They love that he's approved that pipeline. But he won't come to British Columbia to make the same case. When he went coast to coast after his trip to Billionaire Island and he needed a distraction, he went coast to coast. Well, not actually, he didn't go coast to coast. He went coast to the Rocky Mountains. He didn't quite make it to the BC coast. He didn't quite come to Burnaby or Vancouver to talk about this pipeline because it's easy to give a speech about approving a pipeline in Calgary to oil executives there. It's tougher to come to a skeptical audience in British Columbia and sell the merits of this pipeline. And that's what we're calling on him to do. We're calling on the Prime Minister to come to British Columbia. Premier Christy Clark has requested him come and talk about the pipeline, sell the benefits of the pipeline to British Columbians. He won't do it. He hasn't done it. Norman Spector, who is a former PMO official in the Mulrooney era, he actually helped negotiate the BC NDP Green Socialist Manifesto, which is part of why we're here today, quite frankly, Madam Speaker, is there's been movements in BC for the forces of no, the coalition of the unwilling, people that want to oppose every natural resource project in the province, including this pipeline, have indicated that they intend to try to form a coalition government. And the primary purpose of that manifesto is to try to kill the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And so we believe that this House needs to pronounce on that. This House needs to indicate that this is a good project, that this is something that is good for Canadian energy workers, for the middle-class families who work hard every day to put food on the table. That's what this is about. It's about supporting the energy sector. And we know it can be done safely. The Prime Minister talks about the environment and the economy needing to go hand in hand. Of course, we did the exact same thing when we were in government. But the funny thing is, when he comes to British Columbia, when he comes, he doesn't talk about the economic benefits. He doesn't talk about this pipeline. And if the Prime Minister doesn't start to invest some of his political capital in this project, if he leaves it to the provincial government, if he leaves it to industry, this pipeline will not get built. And we know why he won't come to BC to promote this pipeline. It's because of the fear of the 17 Liberal members of Parliament from that province. They, along with our friends in the NDP, are cheering this coalition, this forces of no. They want this pipeline to die. And how do we know that, Mr. Speaker? There isn't a word from the 17 Liberal members of Parliament in British Columbia in support of this pipeline. Though their Prime Minister has been clear, we know from their public record that they oppose it. The Minister of Justice is on the record, before she became a Liberal politician, vehemently opposed to pipelines. The member for Burnaby, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, has said there is no consent for this pipeline. We need to come together here in this House. Those Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia need to get behind this project and realize that it's good for our nation's economy, that the project is safe, that the project has been subjected to all of the appropriate reviews, that, as the Prime Minister said, the NDP Premier of Alberta supports this. The NDP Premier of Alberta supports it, yet Liberal MPs from British Columbia are trying to stand in the way. So we call on the Prime Minister of Canada to get behind the project. He has approved it. The Prime Minister has personally approved this project. Come to British Columbia. Talk to British Columbians about why it was approved. Talk to British Columbians about the benefits of the project, and stop putting the jobs of Liberal members of Parliament in BC ahead of the jobs of the Canadian energy worker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I come from certainly the opposite end of the country to the member for Chilliwack, Hope. And I would say this just in beginning, that I think the member could be giving the Prime Minister a fair bit of credit for coming out and supporting this project, but that is beside the point. I want to make that point, though, because the Prime Minister has been on side, and let's not forget that. But my comment really is to the fact that even where I am in Atlantic Canada, and I live in Prince Edward Island, this pipeline is seen as much needed. We need the energy east as well, in my opinion, and it is the safest way of which to move oil. But from my area, there's a lot of jobs. We used to have several flights out of Moncton to Fort McMurray and elsewhere that are now not there because of the oil downturn. So I just want to point out, and see if the member agrees, that this is not only just important for jobs in the West, it's important for the economy and jobs right across the country.
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Well, that is impressive. I agree 100% with that, Madam Speaker. I think the member has eloquently provided a summary of why this is not just a case of being beneficial to Alberta. I know in my own riding there were people that traveled back and forth to the oil sands, leaving their families for weeks and sometimes months at a time to put food on the table in Chilliwack, 1,000 kilometers away from Fort McMurray. So I agree with him. Right across the country, the benefits are there. But we know that the Prime Minister can do more. We know that the Prime Minister can cross those Rocky Mountains. He can make that case that this member has so eloquently just made. I wish that member would get invited to the Liberal caucus for British Columbia on Wednesday morning, where he could make the case that they should get behind this pipeline because it's good for the entire country.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Skeena-Balclay Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my friend from British Columbia. I think there was some progress made. So Conservatives said the term social license today in their motion. That was, oh no, to be fair, this was a term for a long time Conservatives just dismissed as airy-fairy and non-existent, but they put it in their motion today. We may disagree on the definition of social license, because with 17 lawsuits against this pipeline, with overwhelming opposition in Vancouver and Burnaby and many places along the route, it'd be kind of tricky to say that there's that broad consensus that this Prime Minister has talked about. But I want to ask him a question, because the Prime Minister did in fact go to British Columbia on May 19th, 10 days after the BC election, in which 60% of voters in that province voted for parties opposed to this pipeline. And my Conservative federal colleagues might not like that, but that's true. And the Prime Minister said all those people who voted for those parties are wrong. They've got it wrong. Here's my specific question. He mentioned water and the importance of water and fish in British Columbia. This is a raw export pipeline. This is a diluted bitumen pipeline. We have no known way to clean up an oil spill in water, a diluted bitumen spill in water. Is this not a concern to his constituents? And is there any remedy that he's aware of that if there was such a spill, we'd be able to clean up even a drop of this stuff?
Honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Mr. Speaker, I know that, in fact, studies have been done that show that this can be transported safely in the marine environment. It can be transported safely on land. And I think I understand where that member is coming from. I'm not sure if he's talked to the member for Edmonton Strathcona about how Rachel Notley has been adamant that this pipeline has social license, that it must be built. Mark her words, she said. Mark my words, it will get built. And then you have John Horgan, who said, I'll do everything in my power to stop it. And so, Madam Speaker, clearly there's a divide in the NDP. In their leadership race, there's some for it, some against it. I understand the dilemma. But the pipeline has been subjected to a stringent, evidence-based scientific review. 157 conditions prove it can be done safely. We believe it should be done for Canadian energy workers.
Resuming debate. We've got a point of order from the official opposition whip.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As there has been consultations among all of the parties, I believe if you seek it, you'll find consent for the following motion, that at the conclusion of today's debate on the opposition motion, in the name of the member for Chilliwack Hope, that all questions necessary to dispose of the motion be deemed put and a recorded division deemed requested and deferred until Tuesday, June the 6th, 2017, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions.
Does the official opposition whip have unanimous consent of the House to move the motion? La Chambre a entendu l'énoncé de...
The House has heard the motion. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion?
Adopté.
Carried.
Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Lakeland.
Madam Speaker, the world needs Canada's oil, and global oil demand will continue to grow for decades, especially in the world's most populated countries. China's economy is expanding at over 6% annually, and with it, Chinese energy needs grow. Meanwhile, India produces only 1/4 of the oil the Indian people need, with economic growth of over 7% a year and projections that the Indian economy will surpass the American economy by 2040. While the development of and desire for renewable and alternative energies grows worldwide, so too does demand for available, affordable, abundant oil. The International Energy Association projects demand to reach 99 million barrels a day by the end of 2017. The potential for Canada's global role as a responsible supplier of energy and of technology and regulatory expertise is boundless, but it's dependent on Canada being connected to major export markets around the world, especially while the United States, both Canada's biggest importer and now most significant energy competitor, is reducing costs, red tape, and ramping up domestic oil production to enhance American energy independence. Canada is the 6th largest producer of oil in the world, with the 3rd largest proven oil reserves of any country on Earth, the vast majority in the oil sands. And unlike most major oil producers globally, Canada is a stable and free democracy with the most stringent environmental regulations and enforcement and human rights, labor standards, and a fundamental philosophy that natural resources belong to citizens. So the wealth derived from energy development benefits the people broadly and in multiple ways. But despite these competitive and capacity advantages, only 4% of the world's daily oil production comes from Canada, which is forced to be a global oil price taker, not a price maker. These realities are significant because the sustainability and future of oil and gas development in Canada are key to Canada's long-term prosperity overall and to the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of Canadians across the country right now. Politics in British Columbia puts the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion at risk, with NDP and Green Party leaders pledging to pursue legal action. This $7.4 billion project will create 15,000 jobs in Alberta and BC. The Conference Board of Canada says it's expected to generate at least $46.7 billion in government revenues and the equivalent of over 40,000 jobs from economic spin-offs of this single project alone. It will create desperately needed jobs in Alberta while helping grow British Columbia's economy. Pipelines are crucial economic transportation infrastructure, which Canada needs in all directions to diversify export markets, reduce reliance on the U.S., and enhance Canada's own energy independence and security. But the growing inflammatory ideological activism around pipelines threaten prosperity and opportunity for all Canadians, sometimes in the most crass and dishonest ways. Around 32,000 Métis and First Nations people work in Canada's natural resources sector. In Lakeland and around Alberta, First Nations are very active in oil and gas across the value chain, in upstream exploration and production, and in service supply and technology. But the Liberals and the left often use First Nations as pawns in their anti-energy rhetoric, implying all First Nations and Métis people are against it. But AFN Chief Perry Bellegarde confirms 500 of the 630 First Nations in Canada are open to pipelines and support petroleum development. In fact, 50 First Nations actively support the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion in particular. Representing a riding that includes 8 First Nations and Métis communities in northern rural Alberta, and as a person who happens to be part Ojibwe myself, I am disturbed and disgusted by the left's constant misrepresentation of the perspective on energy development of the majority of First Nations in Canada. First Nations across Western Canada want more pipelines and are increasingly agitating publicly for themselves because that infrastructure is as crucial to the lifeblood of their communities and to opportunities for young people as anywhere else. The debate over pipelines in Canada is as much about trust as it is about economics. It's been odd to watch the minister, sometimes aggressively and sometimes just bewildered, express clear frustrations that Albertans just aren't grateful enough for their pipeline approvals, as if he's not sure why we have the gall to still be so uppity, and as if we are just so hard to please. But the Liberals contradict themselves about oil and gas, depending on where they are or to whom they're talking, because for the Liberals, it's politics. That's why proponents on all sides of the pipeline debate have a hard time believing Liberal rhetoric. But the Liberals' anti-Canadian energy agenda is obvious. They froze pipeline applications, delaying them for months, and launched 4 major regulatory reviews while citing interim measures that didn't actually include any new aspects, except for the proposal of attaching upstream emissions to pipeline approvals, a standard they don't apply to any other major infrastructure projects anywhere in Canada, and more layers of administration costs. This uncertainty deters investment and escalates job losses at the very worst time. The Prime Minister told the world Canada will phase out the oil sands, left the Natural Resources Minister at home during trade and energy-focused trips in the U.S. The Environment Minister, who seems to call the shots, was celebrated by U.S. lobbyists who explicitly oppose Canadian pipelines, and the Natural Resources Minister, new Chief of Staff, wants to keep Canadian oil in the ground, while the NEB, one of the most renowned regulators in the world, is being dismantled and sent to Ottawa. On the same day the Liberals accepted the independent expert recommendation to approve the Trans Mountain and Line 3 expansions, the Prime Minister killed the only actual new proposal to Tidewater, the Northern Gateway pipeline, along with 31 First Nations equity partnerships of $2 billion. It was the first time a Prime Minister overruled or rejected a regulator's independent advice, which was based on the exact same process and evidence as the projects approved by the Liberals. Their talk of science and consultation is so empty, just like the tanker ban, which was directed by the Prime Minister in mandate letters before there was a single environmental safety or economic study, and ultimately absolutely no consultation with First Nations about the ban, which astoundingly applies to only one specific coast, because that incoherence is a product of politics and ideology driving policy and legislation. All Canadians should be concerned when ideological activism dictates government action. A 36-page Elections Canada report confirms the influence of foreign groups on Canadian democracy. At least 3 groups violated Canadian elections law, circumventing spending limits to push their anti-Canadian energy agenda to serve American business and energy interests. The truth is, many anti-Canadian energy groups are funded by American companies precisely to prevent securing diverse export markets for Canadian oil. But the need to accelerate that access has never been more urgent. Canadian pipelines are sustainable, safe, and efficient. 1.25 million more barrels of oil a day are transported across Canada through increased pipeline capacity approved under the previous Conservative government through 4 major pipelines and several others. Thousands of Canadians lost their jobs since 2015, with people in some provinces and regions hit harder than others. The $50 billion loss of investment in Canada's energy sector is the equivalent of losing 75% of auto manufacturing and all of the aerospace sector last year. The economic and social consequences are immense. Spikes in bankruptcies, foreclosures, food bank use, crime, domestic violence, family breakdowns, suicides. The losses in the energy sector are rippling through other sectors and across Canada. Pipelines will get people back to work in the near term and will sustain oil and gas, which are also the biggest investors in Canadian renewable and alternative energy development long into the future. Yet Albertans in particular can't seem to get on the Liberals' priority list. The response by the Liberals to out-of-work energy workers is subsidies for other sectors in other countries, handouts to provincial governments with added roadblocks and conditions to private sector investment like pipelines that would actually create jobs for middle-class Canadians the Liberals purport to care about. The mythical social license is always just out of reach, and it's now clear that no amount of taxing or begging or groveling will earn it from those who never intend to grant it. Oil sands development supports about 400,000 jobs across Canada, thousands of businesses in every province directly dependent on the resource. Those jobs could reach 700,000 by 2030. They provide tax revenue and support major charitable post-secondary community, R&D and education investments and livelihoods across Canada, increasing the standard of living in every community. Alberta has long been a driving force in Canada's economy and a reliable partner in Confederation. As a first-generation born and raised Albertan, I've only ever known my province as a young, dynamic, culturally and economically diverse, pioneering place built by people from everywhere else in Canada, like my family from Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Ontario, single-handedly creating 9 out of 10 jobs in Canada as recently as 2014. Albertans are hardworking and generous, contributing $200 billion between 2000 and 2014 to help lift Canadians in all regions. Even while Albertans lost more jobs than at any other time since Pierre Trudeau was in office, they continue to send billions more to the federal government than they receive in services. This is an issue of national unity. The Prime Minister must support this motion.
No.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And with all due respect to the member opposite, I think she grabbed the wrong speech. We indeed have approved this pipeline, and we did so taking a number of things into consideration and making a number of changes. As an example, the interim principles that were provided around the NEB process create a more robust review, more engagement with Canadians, with Indigenous peoples. The $1.5 billion in the Ocean Protections Plan is another example of how we address some of the concerns around making sure that the economy and the environment go hand in hand. The member mentioned job losses, and certainly the sharp downturn in commodity prices affected the men and women and families and communities in Alberta and indeed across the country. And I'll go back to my colleague, the member from Malpac's comments about job losses across the country. Certainly in my riding, I had a number of people that went out to the west to work and now have come back home because the job market has certainly shrunk. I wonder if the member opposite can talk about the 15,000 jobs are going to be created in Alberta and BC mostly. However, again, people from across the country will return to work. And if she can talk about the impact that will have on her communities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
The interim measures announced by the Liberal government, including community consultation, First Nations input, stakeholders impacted by the pipeline, were nothing new. That was always done in the Canadian regulatory system by the world-renowned National Energy Board. The only thing that was actually new was the attachment of upstream assessments as a condition to pipeline approvals. That is an assessment that would probably stop any other kind of major infrastructure anywhere in the country from being built ever. So that is a direct threat to the jobs and to the long-term prosperity of Albertans and the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who rely on the energy sector. The Liberals did it at the very worst time, and by their ongoing regulatory reviews, put the sector in uncertainty, which is proven by the extreme fleeing of foreign investment and energy investment overall in the country. The ability for Alberta to continue to contribute to Canada is dependent on these pipelines. The Liberals need to do more than talk, and they need to give us a plan as to how they're going to get these pipelines built, and start by supporting this motion.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and through you, I'd like to offer some comments and questions to the member. Madam Speaker, I have to feel I'm absolutely astounded at the tone of the remarks, and I will leave it to the 600 plus First Nations of Canada, the Métis peoples and Inuit, to say whether or not their views are perhaps as equally important as that one member. She said that her view overrides all of them. No, Madam Speaker, yes, in fact, we once had a revered institution, the National Energy Board, and we have also got some problems with the way the process has been going on in Alberta, with some reforms hopefully proceeding. But, Madam Speaker, we just had 2 expert panels, having consulted all across the country, recommending similar changes, that the public has lost trust in both the environmental assessment and National Energy Board processes, and made very strong recommendations to improve. And one of the most important cases coming forward to the Supreme Court is they've given leave to the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation to raise their concerns. They were not consulted by her government, by the Conservative government, and all the changes they brought to the NEB environmental assessment process through omnibus budget bills. Would she like to respond to that, that perhaps they played a role in the problems we're facing in opposition to major energy projects?
The honourable member for Lakeland has 1 minute to respond.
Yeah, I guess I can understand why an NDP MP from downtown Edmonton has no idea how First Nations and Métis people who live next door to energy development and pipelines actually are involved in the oil and gas sector, and how important it is to all of their communities. By the way, Premier Notley says that moving the NEB to Ottawa is dumb. So I guess there's no friend for the province like their NDP counterparts in the House of Commons. But this is what's really at stake. Albertans and my constituents are losing faith. They're not the kind of people to lay down or to stand idly by while they are taken for granted and attacked. So the Liberals must turn their attention to this issue urgently and seriously. They must not allow the debate on interprovincial transportation, a subject which is federal jurisdiction, to continue to divide Canadians. And the Prime Minister in my riding in 2013 said, "This country is not about picking and choosing the areas you think you might be popular in. It's about connecting and building a broad sense of where this country needs to go, and he needs to do it."
Resuming debate, the reprise de débat, the Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleagues, the members for Regina Capel, Chilliwack Hope, and Portage Lisgar for their important and timely motion. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I confess that I find myself today in something of an uncomfortable position. Generally, I would consider any alignment of the views of the members opposite and my own as a source of discomfort or even of soul-searching. In the case of this motion, though, we agree. Nonetheless, playing politics with economically vital projects like this is exactly why Stephen Harper got nothing built in 10 years. But more important than my agreement with the contents of this motion is my
from Battle River Crowfoot that he will have an opportunity to ask questions and comments when that time is coming up. And so I would hope that he will afford the minister the respect that he deserves to do his speech. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
But more important than my agreement with the contents of this motion is my complete agreement with the views on this project of our Prime Minister. As honourable members will know, in the immediate aftermath of the election in British Columbia, the Prime Minister publicly and clearly reiterated our government's support for the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project. He reinforced the case that our support for this project was made using a rigorous and thorough process, and it was based on science and facts, not political rhetoric. At the moment, the future of the British Columbia government remains in question, Premier Clark has indicated her intention to face the legislature and test its confidence in her government. I cannot predict the outcome of a vote of confidence in the British Columbia legislature, but what I can say is that whatever the result of that vote, our government stands behind the decision we made to approve the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Why? Because it was the right decision when we made it last November. It was the right decision the day before the British Columbia election, and it's the right decision now. So while the government in BC may change, the facts, the science, the evidence, the environmental considerations, the economic benefits, the jobs, all of these remain unchanged. The project was, and this project is, in the best interests of Canadians. So I welcome the support of the members opposite. I welcome their recognition of the wisdom of our decision. I welcome their pointing out through this motion that the project has social license to proceed, that it is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, that it is safe and environmentally sound, as recognized by the National Energy Board, and that it is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation. It is rare when the official opposition is a leading advocate for a government policy, but I can tell this House, Madam Speaker, that that is something I could get used to. Mr. Speaker, the motion before us deserves a fuller articulation, so let me address its various elements one by one. It asks this House to agree that the project has social license. Although I think we can all agree that this is an outdated term, one does not simply get a lose or a yes of social support. It is a daily responsibility to serve Canadians and constantly rebuilding trust in government. So, how did this project achieve something that the previous government was unable to do? To diversify markets for our resources during its entire time in office? The answer is straightforward. Our government listened to Canadians. The previous government believed it knew best without needing to ask for any other opinions. There must be a certain comfort in knowing all without asking Canadians what their opinions are on such project as this. We listened closely. We heard that not all Canadians agree, and that's okay. What we heard most strongly is that Canadians are tired of the polarization of the environment versus the economy. We are all in this together. Under the previous government, Canadians have simply lost trust in the environmental assessment and review processes because the outcomes were predetermined. They had come to believe that when weighing economic benefits and environmental stewardship, that the scales had become tipped too far in one direction. Our government set about regaining the trust of Canadians. We did so by taking a different approach. We reached out to Indigenous communities. We consulted meaningfully, something the Federal Court of Appeal said the previous government had not done sufficiently with the Northern Gateway project, which is the reason its permit was revoked. In the case of the Trans Mountain Expansion project, government officials consulted with 117 Indigenous groups, and the results are publicly available. We have set aside more than $64 million to fund an Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee to meaningfully engage Indigenous groups in monitoring the project over its lifespan, the first time in Canadian history, a step never before taken by any previous government. And our government listened to environmental groups and to those living in the affected communities. We listened to academics and to industry. We extended the consultation period to ensure that as many voices as possible could be heard. But we didn't stop there. To regain the confidence of Canadians, we also initiated a modernization of the National Energy Board to ensure that its composition reflects regional views and has sufficient expertise in environmental science, community development, and Indigenous traditional knowledge. We're now in the process of determining how these changes can best be made. Madam Speaker, Canadians know that the path to a lower carbon future may be long, but it is well underway. It is accelerating, and its trajectory is clear. They know that the economy of tomorrow will require investments today in clean technologies, energy efficiency, and renewable sources of energy. Our government has taken action on all these fronts, including doing what virtually every economist and energy company says is the best, most effective way to lower greenhouse gas emissions and spur innovation, putting a price on carbon. In fact, in our government's first budget, we made generational investments in clean energy and new technologies, including technologies that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector. We will build that clean growth economy, and we are, but we are not there yet, due to nearly a decade of inaction by the previous government. With all these initiatives, consulting Indigenous communities, engaging Canadians, focusing on sustainability, modernizing the National Energy Board, and investing in green technologies, we send a very clear signal to Canadians and to the world, Madam Speaker. Under this government, environmental sustainability will go hand in hand with economic development. We cannot have one without the other. Hear, hear. The actions we took, the investments we made, and the approach we embraced demonstrated the commitment and earned the confidence of Canadians. Madam Speaker, the motion before us also speaks to the importance of the Trans Mountain Expansion project to the Canadian economy and to creating thousands of jobs. Indeed, this $7.4 billion project will have significant economic benefits. The project is expected to create 15,000 new jobs during construction. This is good news for workers in Alberta. It's good news for workers in British Columbia. It's good news for all of Canada. And it's good news for Indigenous peoples who will benefit from jobs and business opportunities as a result of the impact benefit agreements they have signed with Kinder Morgan. The Trans Mountain expansion is also expected to generate more than $3 billion in revenue for governments, revenues that can be used to invest in health care, in schools, water treatment plants, safer roads, improving the lives of millions of Canadians. This is a vital project in a vital industry, an industry that has been hit hard over the past few years. I know that every member of this House understands what the effect of lower oil prices has had on Albertans. The economic impacts may be measured in rigs closed, barrel cuts, or investments deferred, but they are felt in the lives of families and experienced in hard conversations around kitchen tables. We took action to support families in the energy sector by extending EI benefits in affected regions, including parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Northern Ontario, and Newfoundland and Labrador. We also provided additional support to families in the prairie provinces under the Canada Child Benefit. To give more Canadians greater access to good, well-paying jobs, our government invested in training for unemployed and underemployed workers and will develop a new framework to support union-based apprenticeship training. For those families in Alberta and British Columbia, the Trans Mountain Expansion project offers much-needed hope and good jobs. No wonder, then, that Premier Notley praised the Prime Minister for extraordinary leadership and said that, quote, "It has been a long, dark night for the people of Alberta, but we are finally seeing some morning light," unquote. The Premier also pointed to a key benefit of this project when she said, quote, "We're getting a chance to reduce our dependence on one market and therefore to be more economically independent, and we're getting a chance to pick ourselves up and move forward again," unquote. Nor, Madam Speaker, is it just Canadians in Alberta and British Columbia who will benefit from the Trans Mountain Expansion project. A 2014 study by the Canadian Energy Research Institute found that for every job created in Alberta's oil patch, at least 2 more jobs were created across the country. It could be a manufacturing company in Ontario, an engineering firm in Quebec, or an oil worker commuting from one of our coasts. Quite simply, a strong energy industry strengthens us all, and projects such as the Trans Mountain Expansion benefits all Canadians. Madam Speaker, the motion also points out the environmental soundness of this project as determined by the National Energy Board. In improving this project, our government considered the evidence. It weighed the facts, and we agree with the National Energy Board that the project should proceed subject to the 157 binding conditions that will be enforced by the board. Our government considered the fact that without new pipelines, more diluted bitumen would be forced into more rail tanker cars for transport. That would be less economic and more dangerous for communities, producing higher greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time that we approved the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, we also announced a ban on oil tankers in northern BC coastline, more specifically around Dixon Entrance, Hecate Strait, and Queen Charlotte Sound. This coastline is vital to the livelihoods and cultures of Indigenous and coastal communities and is part of a unique and ecologically sensitive region. Honourable members will know that Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, has now been introduced in this House, and I look forward to their support for this vital legislation in the days ahead. As the Minister of Transport has said, the Great Bear region was no place for an oil pipeline, and it's no place for oil tankers either. Our government has also made the most significant investment ever to protect our oceans and coastlines, with the $1.5 billion Oceans Protection Plan, including improving marine traffic monitoring, setting tougher requirements on industry, including for spill response times, making navigation safer, and co-managing our coast with Indigenous and coastal communities. Our government is also committed to consistently increasing our action on climate change. A 1.5-degree world helps no one, and that includes every one of us here and every Canadian that we represent. Inaction comes at too high a cost, whereas a clean growth economy will build more good middle-class jobs across the country. These measures reinforce the importance of carefully balancing environmental protection with economic development as Canada makes the transition to a low-carbon economy. The motion put forward by my honourable colleague points out that the Trans Mountain Expansion Project falls under federal jurisdiction for approval and regulation. Certainly, the Constitution assigns the federal government jurisdiction over interprovincial and international trade. With that jurisdiction comes responsibility to consult widely, to act prudently, and to stand firmly. We know that there are some who disagree with our decision to approve this project, and that they may use the legal system to seek redress. We respect their right to do so, but will strongly defend our decision in court. Our position is clear. The jurisdiction is federal, the decision has been made, and our government will continue to support the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. So on every aspect of this motion, Mr. Speaker, our government finds itself in full agreement. Indeed, as I said in this House to a question from the honourable member for Calgary Forest Lawn, I appreciate their making the case for us. And as I have said many times, one of our government's key responsibilities is to help get Canadian resources to market. With our major customer, the United States, producing more and more of its own energy, it is essential that Canada build the infrastructure to get our oil and gas to new global markets. That's exactly why we have approved projects such as the Trans Mountain Expansion, doing more in 1 year than the previous government did in a decade, protecting our oceans, pricing carbon pollution, resetting our nation-to-nation relations, building a climate change plan, and putting middle-class Canadians back to work today by approving the pipelines we need to reach those new markets. Madam Speaker, there is one final element of this motion that I have not yet addressed, that the Trans Mountain Expansion Project should be constructed with the continued support of the federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of the project. I would have thought that the answer to that request would have been clear from the Prime Minister's statements of the past week. So I was somewhat surprised to hear the honourable member for Regina Qu'Appelle ask in this House whether the Prime Minister will, quote, stand up to the forces that are seeking to kill these jobs, or will he fold like a cardboard cutout, unquote. If I may paraphrase one of the more famous phrases uttered by one of our heroes, Sir Winston Churchill, in this very place, some cardboard, some cutout. Our government will not falter. We will not fail. And we will certainly not fold in our support of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Nor, Mr. Speaker, will we shy away from being a leading force in the global clean growth economy. Neither can be ignored. It's the right thing to do for Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, the rhetorical shots aside, I'm glad to hear that the minister is going to support this motion, that he agrees with every aspect of it, and he has been consistent in that regard for this pipeline. The Prime Minister has said, as I've said, in Houston, Calgary, Rome this week, that he's going to continue to press for this pipeline. He hasn't come to, I wish he would come to British Columbia more to talk about it, and I wish that he could convince the Minister and the Prime Minister could actually convince the 17 Liberal members of Parliament. I hope they read his speech and are as convinced as some of the colleagues that were in his camera shot are, because we have not heard from a single Liberal member of Parliament from British Columbia that whether they agree with the Minister. Can he tell this House, how can we expect to get social license, how can we expect to get the support of the people of British Columbia if he can't even convince the Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia in his own caucus?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Deputy Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my honourable friend, and more than that, I appreciate the excellent work that he's doing as the natural resource critic. And we agree on many things. We agree on doing whatever is reasonable that we can do as a government to look seriously at the Alberta energy industry and how we can help those who are suffering as a result of the downturn, and also to know that the jobs that are created by these major energy projects are of benefit not only to Alberta, but in the case of the Trans Mountain expansion, the people of British Columbia as well. And that is something that's well known to all of our members on this side of the House from all regions. And not only in those regions where the job creation benefit is most direct, in British Columbia and Alberta, but throughout the country, because the energy sector has been a driver, an important one of the Canadian economy for decades. And we believe that it will continue to be. As we make that transition to a low-carbon economy, it's actually the entrepreneurship and the innovation of Albertans and British Columbians that will help us drive. It makes no sense not to use the wealth that we have available in the ground so as to take advantage, not to take advantage of those resource revenues in order to help finance this transition. So it's not only the members of Parliament from British Columbia, but I think it's members of Parliament from all across the country who realize how important the energy sector is to Canadians.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm very proud to stand in this House as a coastal British Columbian and have this opportunity to ask the Minister of Natural Resources. Now, when the Prime Minister came to Esquimalt in August of 2015, he made a solemn promise that the pipeline review process would have to be done, and for Kinder Morgan. The Liberal MP for North Vancouver, who's the Parliamentary Secretary of the Minister of Environment, also repeated this claim that Kinder Morgan must satisfy a new review process. And so did the Liberal Member of Parliament for Burnaby North Seymour. So a simple question, Madam Speaker, to the Minister. Why did the Prime Minister and why did Liberal members of Parliament from British Columbia lie to the people of BC?
Hear, hear.
I just want to remind the member that you are not to indicate whether or not someone has lied or not. You can question why they have said something, but you cannot.
Madam Speaker? I will restate the question. Why did the Prime Minister and Liberal MPs from British Columbia mislead deliberately the people of BC?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Madam Speaker, we came into office with major energy projects under review. We had to make decisions on how those reviews were to be handled, both in the short term, while we look at permanent reforms to the environmental assessment process in Canada. And the member will know that as a part of those interim principles, we established more consultation, not only from government, but also from an expert panel that made its way up and down the line, speaking, I think, extensively and meaningfully with Indigenous communities and others who had an opinion. As a matter of fact, on the website, there were literally tens of thousands of opinions that were expressed by Canadians from coast to coast to coast. That is not something that the process had allowed before. We knew that the National Energy Board, as currently constituted, did not have the confidence of Canadians. So in the case of those projects under review, we added more opportunities, a different set of criteria that led to the decision that, in the opinion of the Government of Canada, this project was in Canada's interests.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Madam Speaker, the debate so far today has been contaminated by so many claims that are contrafactual. In other words, the facts are clear, but the conversation in this place is ignoring them. For instance, the claim is made that shipping bitumen is safer in a pipeline. The opposite is true. When you ask about the safety of pipelines versus trains, the critical question is, what product are you shipping? If you are shipping Bakken shale that blew up in Lac Mégantic, it's clear it should not be on a train. But solid bitumen can only be put in a pipeline once you make it more dangerous by adding diluent, which doubles the shipment times to get it to be made in a substance that can flow. So diluted bitumen in a pipeline, once spills, can't be cleaned up. But solid bitumen on a train is the safest way to move solid bitumen. So that's the first non-fact. The second non-fact is that diluted bitumen can be cleaned up. The member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley already mentioned this, but let me point out two incontrovertible scientific studies that were ignored by the National Energy Board. I intervened in the National Energy Board product, Madam Speaker. The process was flawed from the get-go by lack of procedural fairness, the abuse of the rights of interveners in that process, and the courts will rule on that. But I do need to say, Madam Speaker, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, their premier scientific body, the Royal Society of Canada expert panel, both found that bitumen mixed with diluent does not, at this point, have any science to justify the claim it can be cleaned up. It can't. It still isn't cleaned up in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan, and the minister, no matter how much we now hear from Liberals, what we used to hear from Conservatives, the very well-modified and modulated Kennedy-esque tones do not make non-facts facts.
I just want to remind the members I do have a clock, and I am very cognizant of how long people speak. The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
There's no question. There's commentary. Madam Speaker, always learn from the commentary of the honourable member, and she and I actually sat on the board of the International Institute for Sustainable Development when we were both way younger than we are now. Her extensive knowledge of this file and many others do credit to this chamber. On this item, we disagree.
Time for a brief question. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, a brief question.
Briefly, Madam Speaker, I'm wondering if my colleague could just share with the House the importance of doing the economics and the social issues surrounding the importance of pipeline development.
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Well, Madam Speaker, the world has changed. If this debate would have been 20 years ago, the balance between economic development and environmental stewardship would have been lame. It would not have been at the center of the Canadian consciousness. It is now. If this debate would have taken place 20 years ago, there wouldn't be much attention paid to Indigenous communities. There wouldn't have been much attention paid to the meaningful accommodation that's necessary to gain the support of Indigenous peoples. So the world, and it's not just the world in Canada, because wherever we go internationally, we find that the issues are the same. The issues are about sustainable development. And sustainable development, in the case of Canada, means paying close attention to environmental stewardship, to honor the teachings and the realities of Indigenous communities, and also to know that the energy sector will continue to be an important source of economic development and job creation for Canadians.
Reprise de débat, l'honorable député d'Outremont.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Outremont.
Merci beaucoup.